She had never seen the world the way others did. Colors, faces, sunlight. These were things people described to her, but they existed only as ideas in her mind. She lost her vision when she was very young, too young to even remember what sight felt like. At first, her family thought it was temporary, something that would pass with time. But slowly, the truth became clear. The darkness wasn't leaving. Her world changed, but it did not end. In the beginning, everything felt confusing. She would reach for things that were not where she expected them to be. She would walk into spaces that felt unfamiliar, even inside her own home. Every step needed care. Every movement required attention. While other children ran freely, she learned to move slowly, carefully, counting her steps and listening closely to her surroundings. But something else began to grow in that silence. She started noticing sounds more than anything else. The soft hum of a fan, the distant chatter of people outside, the rhythm of footsteps passing by. Even the wind had its own voice when it brushed against windows or slipped through narrow spaces. What others ignored became her way of understanding the world. And then one day, she heard something that changed everything. It was a piano. The sound came from a nearby community center. Someone had left the doors slightly open, and the melody flowed out into the street. It was soft at first, then it grew stronger, filling the air with something she had never felt before. She stopped walking. She stood there, completely still, as if the sound had gently held her in place. She didn't know what it was called at the time. She didn't understand music in the way others did. But she felt it, deeply. That moment stayed with her. Days later, she asked her family about the sound. They explained what a piano was and where it came from. She asked if she could go there. At first, they hesitated. They were protective, worried about her safety, worried about how she would manage. But her request was quiet and firm. It wasn't a passing interest. It was something more. Eventually, they agreed. The first time she touched the piano, she didn't know what to expect. Her fingers rested on the keys, unsure, hesitant. The surface felt smooth and cool. Someone nearby guided her hands gently and pressed one of her fingers down. A single note rang out. She smiled instantly. It was simple, but it meant everything. That one sound opened a door she didn't even know existed. She pressed another key, then another. Each note felt like a step into a new world, one where she didn't need to see anything to understand it. From that day on, she kept coming back. The piano at the center wasn't new. Some of the keys were slightly worn, and a few notes didn't sound perfectly right. But none of that mattered to her. To her, it was perfect. It was something she could connect with completely. First, she just explored. She pressed keys randomly, listening to how they sounded together. She tried to remember patterns, slowly building her own understanding. Sometimes it sounded messy, sometimes it felt right, but she never got frustrated. Every mistake was just another sound to learn from. A kind volunteer at the center noticed her interest. Instead of treating her differently, they simply sat beside her and guided her patiently. They didn't rush her. They didn't overwhelm her. They just helped her understand one small thing at a time. She learned how different notes felt under her fingers. She learned how rhythm worked, how pauses could be just as important as sound. While others relied on reading music sheets, she relied on memory and feeling. She listened carefully and repeated what she heard until it became part of her. Her progress was slow, but steady. At home, she didn't have a piano, but that didn't stop her. She would tap her fingers on any flat surface she could find. Tables, books, even her own knees. She imagined the keys in her mind, remembering how they were arranged. Her family often watched her quietly, amazed at how focused she became. She didn't talk much about what she was doing. She didn't try to impress anyone. It wasn't about that. It was something personal, something that belonged only to her. People around her began to notice. Some were kind. They admired her determination and often encouraged her. But not everyone understood. Some whispered things like, "What's the point?" Or, "She can't go far with this." They didn't mean to hurt her, but their words carried doubt. She heard those words, and for a moment they stayed with her. There were days when she questioned herself. Days when she wondered if she was just chasing something impossible. After all, the world she lived in wasn't designed for someone like her to succeed easily. Every step forward required more effort than most people could see. But every time she sat at the piano, those doubts slowly faded. Because when she played, she didn't feel limited. She didn't feel different. She felt free. Music gave her something no one else could take away. It didn't judge her. It didn't question her ability. It simply responded to her touch. If she pressed the key, it answered. If she played with feeling, it reflected that feeling back to her. That connection became her strength. Over time, her playing improved in ways that surprised even those who had been teaching for years. She developed a natural sense of timing. She could remember long sequences without hesitation. More importantly, she played with emotion, something that couldn't be taught easily. She didn't just play notes. She told stories through sound. Even people who had heard many skilled musicians found themselves drawn to her music. There was something honest about it. Something real. It wasn't perfect in a technical sense, but it didn't need to be. It had something deeper. Still, she remained the same. Quiet, focused, humble. She never thought of herself as special. To her, she was simply doing what felt right. She didn't compare herself to others. She didn't dream about fame or recognition. She just wanted to keep playing. As time passed, the community center became like a second home to her. It was a place where she felt understood without needing to explain herself. The sounds, the space, the familiar path to the piano. It all became part of her routine. And yet, beyond that small world, something much bigger was waiting. She didn't know it yet. She didn't know that her quiet practice sessions would one day lead her to a moment that would change everything. She didn't know that people far beyond her small circle would hear her music. She didn't know that the same world that once doubted her would soon watch in silence. For now, she was just a girl sitting at an old piano, pressing keys with careful hands, listening closely to every sound. In a world she could not see, she was slowly creating something beautiful. And it was only the beginning. The small community center had always been a quiet place, but over time, it started to feel different. More people began to visit, especially on weekends. Word had slowly spread about a girl who could play the piano in a way that touched people deeply. Some came out of curiosity, while others came because someone they trusted told them they should listen. She never noticed the growing attention in the same way others did. To her, it was just another day, another chance to sit at the piano and lose herself in the music. But the people around her could see it clearly. Something special was happening. One afternoon, as she finished playing, she noticed a change in the room. The usual soft murmurs were replaced with a kind of quiet that felt heavier. Someone approached her and gently told her that a guest had been listening. It turned out that a well-known music teacher from the city had stopped by the center. He had originally come for something unrelated, but when he heard the piano, he paused. He stood at a distance at first, listening without interrupting. By the time she finished, he had already made up his mind. This was not ordinary talent. He spoke kindly, asking her simple questions about how long she had been playing and where she had learned. She answered honestly, explaining that she mostly practiced by listening and remembering. There were no big words, no attempt to impress, just simple truth. The teacher seemed both surprised and impressed. Before leaving, he spoke with the staff at the center and her family. He suggested something that felt almost too big to believe. A music event was going to be held in the city, a gathering where talented performers from different places would come together and play. It wasn't a small event. It had an audience, judges, and even some well-known names in the music world. He thought she should be there. At first, the idea felt distant, almost unreal. The city itself was a place she had never explored beyond a few visits. The thought of standing on a stage in front of a large crowd made her uneasy. She wasn't used to that kind of attention. Her music had always been something personal, shared in a small, familiar space. Her family felt the same mix of emotions: pride, excitement, and worry. They knew how much effort it had taken for her to reach this point. They also knew how fragile confidence could be, especially in a world that often judged quickly. What if people didn't understand her style? What if the pressure became too much? But the teacher didn't push. He simply said the opportunity was there, and it would remain open if she wanted to take it. Days passed, and the idea stayed in her mind. She returned to the piano as she always did, but something had changed. Her thoughts were no longer just about the notes. She found herself imagining a larger space, a bigger audience, unfamiliar sounds around her. It made her nervous, but it also stirred something else, curiosity. One evening, after a long practice session, she finally spoke about it. She didn't say much, just a quiet sentence, almost like a question. She said she wanted to try. That was enough. Preparation began slowly. There was no sudden rush or dramatic change. Instead, it was careful and steady. The teacher from the city started visiting more often, guiding her with patience. He didn't try to change her style. He understood that her strength came from the way she felt the music, not just how she played it. He helped her refine what she already had. They worked on timing, on transitions between notes, on making each part of the piece flow naturally. Sometimes they repeated the same section again and again until it felt right. Other times, they simply sat in silence, letting her process what she had learned. She listened closely, absorbing every detail. At the same time, she continued practicing alone. Late evenings became her favorite time. The center would be quieter, almost empty. In that silence, she could focus completely. Every sound became clearer. Every mistake stood out, but so did every improvement. There were moments of frustration. Some parts of the piece were harder than others. Her fingers would hesitate, or the rhythm would slip. On those days, she would pause, take a deep breath, and start again. She never rushed through it. She believed that if she kept going, slowly and patiently, it would come together. And it did. As the days moved closer to the event, the reality of it became stronger. People around her started talking about it more often. Some offered encouragement, while others simply wished her well. The community center felt proud, almost protective, as if they were sending one of their own into a much bigger world. But not everyone was convinced. There were still quiet doubts, spoken in low voices. Some wondered if she was ready for such a stage. Others questioned whether someone who couldn't see could handle the pressure of performing in front of experienced musicians and a large audience. She heard those thoughts, even when they weren't directed at her. This time, though, they didn't stay with her as long. Something inside her had grown stronger. Maybe it was the hours of practice. Maybe it was the belief others had started to show in her. Or maybe it was simply the connection she felt every time her fingers touched the keys. Whatever it was, it gave her a sense of calm. The day before the event, she visited the community center one last time before leaving for the city. She sat at the piano just like she always had. No audience, no expectations. Just her and the music. She played slowly at first, letting each note settle. Then she continued, moving through the piece she had practiced so many times. Felt familiar now, almost like a story she knew by heart. When she finished, there was silence. But it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that holds something meaningful, something complete. She smiled softly. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about whether she would succeed or fail. She wasn't thinking about the crowd, the judges, or the stage. She was simply ready. That night, as she prepared to leave for the city, her family stayed close. There were quiet words of encouragement, gentle reassurances. They didn't try to make big promises. They just reminded her of how far she had come. And that was enough. The journey ahead was uncertain. The stage would be different. The people would be unfamiliar. The expectations would be higher. But she wasn't the same girl who had first touched the piano with hesitation. She had grown. She had learned. And now she was stepping into something new. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. The opportunity was no longer just a possibility. It was real. And it was waiting for her. The city felt louder than anything she had ever known. From the moment she arrived, every sound seemed to overlap. Cars passing, people talking, doors opening and closing somewhere in the distance. It was not overwhelming in a frightening way, but it was different. She could feel the size of the place through its noise alone. The building where the event was going to take place was much larger than the community center she was used to. Even the air inside felt different, cooler and more controlled. Her steps echoed slightly as she walked through the long hallway, guided carefully by someone from the organizing team. Every movement reminded her that she was far from the small, familiar space where she had learned to play. Still, she stayed calm. She held on to the same quiet focus that had carried her this far. Her fingers moved slightly as she walked, almost like they were remembering the keys even when she wasn't touching them. It was something she did without thinking now, a habit that helped her stay connected to her music. The rehearsal room was already filled with people. She could tell just by listening. Different voices, different tones, bits of conversation floating through the air. Some sounded confident, even proud. Others were softer, more careful. Instruments were being tuned, notes being tested. It felt like a space where everyone had come to prove something. For a brief moment, she stood still near the entrance. No one noticed her at first, and she was okay with that. She preferred observing quietly, letting her surroundings settle in her mind. Someone gently led her to a chair near one side of the room. She sat down and listened. It helped her understand the space, the distance between sounds, the rhythm of movement around her. One by one, participants were called to rehearse. Each performance brought a different feeling into the room. Some were fast and technical, filled with sharp, confident notes. Others were slower, more emotional. People clapped politely after each turn. But there was also a quiet sense of comparison in the air. When her name was finally called, the room shifted slightly. A few voices lowered. Some people whispered. She could sense the attention turning toward her, even before she stood up. It wasn't the same kind of attention she was used to back at the community center. This felt more uncertain, more questioning. She walked toward the piano with steady steps. Someone guided her hand gently to the edge of the instrument, and from there, she found her way to the bench. She sat down, placed her hands softly on her lap for a moment, and took a slow breath. The room was quiet now. She reached forward and let her fingers find the keys. For a second, everything else disappeared. She pressed the first note. It was softer than she expected, but clear. She adjusted her touch slightly and continued. The melody began to form, simple at first, then growing more confident as she moved through the piece. She didn't rush. She never did. Each note was placed with care, guided by memory and feeling rather than sight. She listened closely, adjusting her timing naturally. The room stayed quiet, but the silence felt different now. It was focused, attentive. But then, something changed. A chair shifted. Footsteps moved closer. And then a voice spoke. It was calm, but sharp enough to cut through the music. The voice belonged to one of the most respected pianists attending the event. A name people spoke with admiration and sometimes even fear. He had been sitting toward the front, listening to each performance with a critical ear. He didn't wait for her to finish. "That's enough," he said. The words landed heavily in the room. Her fingers paused instantly, still resting on the keys. The note she had just played faded into silence. For a moment, she didn't move. She wasn't sure if she had made a mistake or if something else had gone wrong. The voice continued. "There is feeling," he said, "but technique matters too." The tone wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made everyone listen. He took a few steps closer. "In music, interpretation is important," he added. "But without precision, it loses its strength. And without being able to see the structure, it becomes even harder." The room stayed silent. No one interrupted. No one disagreed. His words weren't shouted. They weren't openly cruel. But there was something in the way he spoke that made it clear what he believed. To him, her limitation was not something that could be overlooked. It was something that held her back. She sat there quietly, her hands still on the piano. Inside, the words echoed. She had heard doubts before. She had heard people question her ability. But this felt different. This wasn't someone speaking from a distance. This was someone respected. Someone whose opinion carried weight in the world she was stepping into. For a moment, she felt small. Not because she believed she had no talent, but because the space around her suddenly felt less welcoming. The confidence she had built through hours of practice seemed to waver. Someone in the room shifted uncomfortably. Another voice tried to speak, but stopped. The silence stretched. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys and placed them back in her lap. Her expression didn't change much, but something inside her had been shaken. She nodded slightly, even though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was out of respect. Maybe it was because she didn't know what else to do. The organizers gently guided her away from the piano. No one said anything directly to her as she stepped aside. The next participant was called, and the rehearsal moved on as if nothing had happened. But it had. She could still hear his words in her mind. There is feeling, but that small pause between his words stayed with her the most. She returned to her seat, sitting quietly while others performed. The sounds around her felt different now. Instead of absorbing them naturally, she found herself comparing, questioning, wondering if she truly belonged in that room. Doubt is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It simply sits there, slowly growing if you let it. For the first time in a long while, she felt it clearly. When the rehearsal ended, people began to leave in small groups. Conversations filled the room again, but she didn't join them. She stayed seated for a while, letting the space empty around her. Finally, someone approached her. It was the same teacher who had encouraged her to come. He didn't start with advice. He didn't mention what had happened. He simply asked if she was okay. She hesitated before answering. Then she said yes. But her voice was quieter than usual. He understood anyway. Without saying too much, he suggested they step outside for some fresh air. The hallway felt calmer now, away from the noise of the rehearsal room. They walked slowly without rushing. After a few moments, he spoke. "Not everyone listens the same way," he said gently. She didn't respond, but she listened. "Some people focus only on what they expect to hear," he continued. "They forget that music can be experienced in different ways." His words didn't erase what had happened, but they softened it. She nodded slightly, holding on to that thought. That evening, back in her room, she sat in silence for a long time. There was no piano there, no keys to press, no notes to guide her thoughts. Just quiet. And in that quiet, she faced a choice. She could let the doubt grow, or she could return to the one thing that had never failed her, her connection to music. It wasn't an easy moment, but somewhere deep inside, beneath the uncertainty, something steady remained. The same feeling she had the first time she touched the piano. The same calm that carried her through every challenge. It hadn't disappeared. It was still there, waiting for her to find it again. The room felt quieter that night than it should have. Even though the city outside was still alive with noise, inside her small space everything seemed still. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting gently in her lap, listening to the faint sounds coming from the street below. Car passed by. Someone laughed in the distance. A door closed somewhere down the hallway. But none of those sounds stayed with her for long. Her mind kept returning to the same moment. The pause in her playing. The voice that stopped her. The words that followed. "There is feeling, but..." She repeated that line silently over and over again. Not because she wanted to, but because it had settled into her thoughts and refused to leave. It wasn't just what was said. It was how it was said. Calm, certain, final. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like going near a piano. That feeling confused her. Music had always been the place she returned to when things became difficult. It had never been something she avoided. Even on her hardest days, she found comfort in the keys, in the simple act of playing a single note and letting it grow into something more. But now something felt different. She stood up slowly and walked a few steps across the room. Her fingers brushed lightly against the wall as she moved, a habit that helped her stay aware of her space. She stopped near the window, though she could not see it. She could feel a slight difference in the air, a cooler presence that told her where it was. She stayed there for a while. Then, without thinking too much, she spoke softly to herself. Was he right? The question didn't come with anger. Came with honesty. She knew she had feeling when she played. People had told her that many times. She could sense it in the way they listened, in the silence that followed her music. But what about the other part? The part he had pointed out. Technique, precision, structure. Things she had worked on but never in the same way others had. She slowly shook her head. The doubt was real, but so was everything she had built until now. She took a deep breath and stepped away from the window. "I need to hear it again," she whispered. There was a small practice room down the hallway, one that had been made available for participants. She hadn't planned to use it that night, but now it felt like something she needed to do. The hallway was quiet as she walked. Most people had already returned to their rooms. The lights hummed softly above, and her footsteps echoed gently with each step. She followed the path carefully, counting turns, remembering the way she had been guided earlier. When she reached the practice room, she paused for a moment outside the door. Her hand hovered near the handle. There was hesitation, not fear exactly, but something close to it. Then she opened the door. The room was still. The piano sat quietly in the center, waiting. It was different from the one at the community center, newer, more polished. Even the air around it felt more controlled, less familiar. She walked toward it slowly. Each step felt heavier than usual, as if she was carrying something unseen. When she reached the bench, she didn't sit right away. She stood there, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the piano. For a moment, she simply listened. There was no audience, no whispers, no voice to interrupt, just silence. She sat down. Her hands rested on her lap again, just like before. But this time she didn't rush to the keys. She let the silence settle first, letting her thoughts slow down. Then she lifted her hands. Her fingers found the keys carefully, almost like they were reconnecting with something they had missed. She pressed one note. It rang out softly. She waited. Then she pressed another. This time she listened more closely, not just to the sound but to how it felt under her fingers. The pressure, the timing, the space between one note and the next. She began to play, slowly at first. Not the full piece, not yet. Just small parts, simple patterns. She focused on each movement, each transition. She paid attention to things she usually let happen naturally. Was the timing steady? Were her fingers moving smoothly? Did the notes connect the way they should? She repeated the same short section again and again. Each time she made a small adjustment, not because someone told her to, but because she could feel it. Minutes passed, then more. The hesitation she felt earlier began to fade, replaced by something more familiar. Focus. Not the kind that blocks everything out, but the kind that brings everything into clarity. She remembered what her teacher had once said. Music is not something you see. It is something you understand. Back then, she had taken those words as comfort. Now she began to see them differently. Understanding didn't mean ignoring technique. It meant connecting everything, feeling, structure, precision, into one. She started again. This time she played a longer section of her piece. She moved carefully, listening to every detail. When something didn't feel right, she stopped. She went back. She tried again. There was no frustration, only patience. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She wasn't trying to silence anyone's doubts. She was simply trying to become better. That shift made all the difference. As she continued, her playing began to change in small but noticeable ways. The flow became smoother. The pauses felt more intentional. The balance between emotion and control started to come together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Hours passed without her noticing. At some point, she stopped and let her hands rest on the keys. The last note faded slowly, leaving behind a quiet that felt full rather than empty. She sat there, breathing softly. Then, almost without thinking, she smiled. Not because everything was solved, but because she had found her way back. The doubt was still there, somewhere in the background, but it no longer controlled her. It had become something else. A reminder that there was always more to learn, more to improve. She stood up slowly, stepping away from the piano. As she reached the door, she paused again. But this time, there was no hesitation, only calm. The next day would bring the real performance, the audience, the expectations, and maybe even the same voice that had stopped her before. But she was not the same person who had walked out of the rehearsal room. Something had shifted. She had faced the doubt instead of running from it. She had listened, learned, and grown. And now she was ready to play again. Not to prove anyone wrong, but to show what she had discovered within herself. And that was something no one could take away from her. The morning of the performance arrived quietly, almost too quietly for a day that carried so much weight. The city outside had already begun its usual rhythm, but inside the building, everything felt slower, more focused. People moved with purpose, voices were softer, and every small sound seemed to matter more. She woke up earlier than usual, not because she had to, but because her mind was already awake. There was no rush in her movements. She sat up slowly, letting the moment settle. Her hands rested gently on the blanket, and for a few seconds she did nothing at all. She listened. The faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, a distant door opening, someone speaking quietly nearby. It all felt familiar now, not overwhelming like it had the day before. Something inside her had changed. The doubt that had once filled her thoughts had softened. It was still there, but it no longer felt heavy. It had become something quieter, something she could carry without letting it control her. She stood up and prepared for the day in silence. There was no need for long conversations or reassurances. Everything she needed was already within her. The hours she had spent practicing, the moments she had struggled through, the calm she had found the night before. It was all still there. When it was time to leave for the hall, someone gently guided her through the familiar path. This time, her steps felt steadier. She remembered the turns, the slight changes in the floor, the way sound shifted in different parts of the building. They reached the performance hall. Even before entering, she could feel the difference. The space was larger than the rehearsal room. The air carried a quiet energy, the kind that builds when many people gather in one place, waiting for something to begin. Voices echoed softly, blending into a steady hum. As she stepped inside, the sound of the room wrapped around her. People were already seated. Some spoke in low voices, others remained silent. There was a sense of expectation in the air, something she could almost feel without needing to see. She was guided to a waiting area behind the stage. Other performers were there too. Some were stretching their fingers, some reviewing their pieces quietly, others simply sitting still. No one spoke much. It was a shared silence, one that came from focus rather than discomfort. She sat down in a chair near the wall. Her hands rested in her lap again, just like they always did before she played. But this time, her fingers moved slightly, as if they were remembering the keys on their own. One of the organizers came by to explain the order of performances. Her name would be called somewhere in the middle. Not too early, not too late. She nodded in understanding. Time passed slowly after that. Each performance on stage could be heard faintly from where she sat. Applause followed each one, sometimes louder, sometimes softer. She didn't try to judge or compare. She simply listened. Then, her name was called. The moment arrived without warning, yet it felt expected. She stood up calmly. Someone approached and guided her toward the stage. The path felt longer than it really was, each step echoing slightly as she walked. The sound of the audience grew clearer, more present. Then she felt it. The open space of the stage. The air changed slightly, becoming more still, more focused. The piano waited at the center, just as it had during rehearsal, but now it felt different. Now it mattered. She was guided to the bench. Her hand found the edge of the piano just like before. She sat down slowly, adjusting her position until it felt right. The audience grew quiet, not completely silent, but close enough. She placed her hands gently on her lap. For a moment, she did nothing. No movement, no sound, just a quiet pause. Some in the audience shifted in their seats. Others leaned forward slightly. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like a space waiting to be filled. Then she lifted her hands. Her fingers found the keys. She pressed the first note. It was clear, stronger than the day before. She continued. The melody began to unfold, slowly at first, just as she had practiced. Each note carried intention. Each movement of her fingers was steady, controlled. There was no rush, no hesitation. She let the music grow naturally. The hall responded. The small sounds of movement faded away. The audience became still. The focus in the room deepened, shifting completely toward the sound of the piano. As she moved into the next part of the piece, something changed. Her confidence became visible, not through her expression, but through her playing. The transitions were smoother. The rhythm was steady. The emotion was still there, but now it was supported by control. It was no longer just feeling. It was understanding. She played as if she was telling a story she had lived through. Every note carried something real, something shaped by her journey, her struggles, her quiet determination. Time seemed to slow. No one spoke. No one moved. Even those who had come with doubt began to listen differently. The piece grew stronger as it continued. The softer sections felt deeper, more meaningful. The louder parts carried strength without losing clarity. She wasn't trying to impress. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply playing. And that honesty filled the room. As she reached the final part of the piece, her hands moved with a natural flow that came from hours of practice and something more. Something that could not be taught easily. The last notes approached. She didn't rush them. She let them breathe. One note, then another, and finally the last. It lingered in the air for a moment before fading into silence. Her hands remained on the keys. Still, calm. The room stayed quiet. For a brief moment, no one reacted. Not because they didn't know what to do, but because they needed a second to absorb what they had just heard. Then it happened. Applause started small. Then it grew. More people joined in, the sound building, filling the entire hall. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was something stronger, something genuine. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys and placed them back in her lap. She didn't move right away. She listened. The sound of the applause, the energy in the room. It was something she had never experienced like this before. But even then, she stayed calm. She stood up slowly. Someone guided her off the stage. As she walked away, the applause continued. Behind her, the piano stood silent again. But the music she had played remained. Not just in the air, but in the people who had heard it. And in that moment, without saying a single word, she had shown everyone something they would not forget. The applause did not fade quickly. Even after she stepped off the stage, the sound followed her, echoing softly through the hallway as she was guided back to the waiting area. It felt distant and close at the same time, like something she could hear but not fully understand yet. She sat down again in the same chair she had used before. Her hands rested in her lap, still calm, though her fingers felt slightly warm from playing. She didn't speak. She didn't try to react. She simply listened as the applause slowly softened and the next performance began on stage. For a few moments, everything felt unreal. Not because she doubted what had happened, but because she had never experienced something like it before. The size of the response, the feeling in the room, it was all new to her. Someone approached her quietly. It was the teacher who had encouraged her from the beginning. He didn't say anything at first. He just placed a hand gently on her shoulder. A simple gesture that carried more meaning than words. "You played well," he said softly. She nodded. "Thank you," she replied, her voice calm. There was no excitement in her tone, no sudden burst of emotion. But there was something steady, something grounded. She didn't need to celebrate loudly. The moment itself was enough. Time passed as the event continued. Other performers went on stage, each bringing their own style and skill. The audience responded to them as well, but there was still a quiet memory of her performance lingering in the air. People began to talk. Soft conversations moved through the crowd, not loud enough to interrupt, but strong enough to carry a message. Some spoke about the feeling in her music. Others mentioned how unexpected it was. A few simply said it was something they would remember for a long time. Eventually, the performances came to an end. The final applause was warm and respectful, filling the hall one last time before settling into a calm silence. The organizers stepped forward, speaking to the audience, thanking everyone for being part of the event. Participants were asked to gather near the stage. She stood up again, guided carefully to the group. She could feel the presence of others around her, hear their small movements, their quiet breaths. Some sounded confident, others nervous, waiting for the final results or recognition. But she wasn't thinking about that. Her mind was still on the piano, on the notes she had played, on the way the music had felt under her fingers. That was what mattered most to her. As the organizers spoke, they began to mention different performances, highlighting moments from the event. When they spoke about her, their tone shifted slightly. They didn't focus on her limitations. They spoke about her music. They described it as honest, expressive, and deeply moving. They mentioned how the room had changed when she began to play, how the audience had responded in a way that felt natural and real. She listened quietly. Then, something unexpected happened. A familiar set of footsteps moved closer. The same voice that had stopped her during rehearsal spoke again. But this time it sounded different. There was no sharpness, no distance, only calm. "I would like to say something," he said. The room became quiet. Everyone listened. He paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "Yesterday," he began, "I spoke too quickly." The words were simple, but they carried weight. "I focused on what I thought was missing," he continued, "and I failed to recognize what was already there." No one interrupted. No one moved. He took another small step forward. "Today I listened differently," he said, "and I was reminded that music is not only about precision or structure. It is also about connection. And that is something you brought to this stage." His words were directed toward her. She stood still, listening. There was no reaction from her at first. Not because she didn't understand, but because she was taking it in slowly, carefully. He continued, "Skill can be taught," he said, "but the ability to make people feel something, that is rare." The room remained silent. Then he added one last sentence. "And today you showed that clearly." For a moment nothing happened. Then the audience began to applaud again. This time the sound felt different. It wasn't just appreciation. It was respect. She lowered her head slightly, acknowledging the moment in her own quiet way. She didn't step forward. She didn't try to respond with words. She didn't need to. The message had already been shared. After the event ended, people slowly began to leave. Some stopped to speak with the performers. Others simply walked out quietly, still thinking about what they had experienced. A few approached her. Their words were kind, simple, and genuine. They didn't use complicated language. They didn't try to analyze her performance. They just said how it made them feel. And she listened. That meant more to her than anything else. Later, as she prepared to leave the hall, she passed by the stage one last time. She paused near the piano, reaching out gently to touch its surface. Felt the same. Still. Silent. But now it carried a memory. She smiled softly. The journey back felt different from the journey there. The same hallways, the same sounds, but everything felt lighter. Not because something had been proven, but because something had been understood. She had faced doubt. She had listened to it. She had learned from it. And then she had moved forward. Not perfectly, but honestly. As she stepped outside, the sounds of the city returned, just as they had when she first arrived. Cars passing, people talking, life moving in every direction. But this time she felt part of it in a new way. Not as someone standing on the edge, but as someone who had stepped into her place. Her story didn't end there. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, more opportunities to grow. But now she carried something stronger than before. Not just skill, not just confidence, but a quiet understanding of who she was and what she could do. And that understanding would guide her just like music always had. One note at a time.